let me start with the basics. I was born in Hungary, and this story will mostly exclusively be about Hungary. I was born in the year 1944, and again, most of the story will be about that year. I came to England at age 12 and went straight to school, did my sixth form and university. Yeah. So from that point onwards, I was almost an English person. Wrong way. I learned to use this, don't I?
Downwards. Is it downwards?
These are my parents and my sister, and it's a picture of them pre-war, before I was born. Just to give you an idea that my family, that's without me at the time obviously, had a very pleasant life. My father was director of a public company. My sister went to nursery school, usual kind of thing, and we lived in a very nice area. All was well. I'm sorry about this. Okay, now I got it. So I want to put that into a context.
Can you hear fine at the back? Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you.
We do have sound, but it's just not working very well. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. So long as people can hear.
Yeah, if you can't. If you can't hear properly, just put your hand up, please, and I'll know. So I wanted to put into context, in historical context of Hungary. I'm sure you know that it's quite a small country in the middle of Europe, more or less, stuck between Germany and Russia. It used to be quite a large country until the First World War, and then after that it was a small country. The story of Jews in Hungary is more or less this. There have been Jews in Hungary since Roman times. They got full civil rights in 1867, which meant that the Jewish community flowered because they were allowed to live normal lives and be in the professions and go to university and the like. This actually generated a wave of anti-Semitism because many of them were successful very quickly. And the first anti-Semitic laws in Europe in modern times, I'm not talking about medieval times, was introduced in Hungary in 1920. It was actually a law to limit the number of young people being able to go to university and to limit the number of Jewish staff in university. That had a very unusual result was that a lot of university lecturers have lost their jobs and they had to teach in high schools instead, and that raised the quality of the high schools very much. You may not realize, but important fact is that Hungary was allied to Germany in the Second World War. The reasons for that were primarily political. The leaders of the Hungarian government at the time thought that they might get back some of the territories which they lost in after the First World War, Versailles. And as a result, in 1940 again, a new law was passed, which meant that Jewish men were called up for forced labor. They were not allowed to be in the army, so they weren't called up for normal military service. They were called up for labor. Some of these people were taken abroad, either to Ukraine or to salt mines in Bor. And of these people who were taken abroad, 90% died one way or another. Very, very few came back. The ones who were used for digging ditches and the like in Hungary, they had about 50% chance of survival to the end of the war. My father was in this group of forced laborers. He was very fortunate. I should say that as I'm a survivor, my story is full of fortunate events, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So he was fortunate in that he was never taken out of the country. He had to do manual work, but it wasn't a problem until the year 1944. This is his ID card as forced laborer, and the important thing perhaps is that big ZS in red on the front cover, which stands for Jew in Hungarian. So the year 1944, I should say that in the years in between 40 and 44, there were some anti-Semitic laws passed, but it wasn't. There were no lethal events. People who were in the country were, by and large, safe. And I should also say that the Jews in Hungary thought that they would remain safe because they felt themselves to be Hungarian, and they were on the right side, the wrong side, if you see. They were on the side of the Germans. And up till the 1944, the Hungarian leader, who was anti-Semitic, but not in a lethal way, if I may put it like that, it was one of his ways of standing up to Hitler, his ally. He said, I decide what happens to Jews in Hungary, not you. And as a result, my family were okay. My father was dismissed from his job because it was a public company, and Jews weren't allowed to be on boards of public companies. He then had a business. Then a new law came out that Jews were not allowed to own businesses. So he had a trusted friend who was a non-Jew, and he signed over the business to him. This man was called Lajos Taylor, and his name will come up again. In March of 1944, the German army walked into Hungary. They were unopposed, and you could say it was a military maneuver because they had to strengthen their front in Russia, but it did mean that in practice, things changed. And almost immediately, they introduced a law to say that Jews had to wear a yellow star. I've got one of these, and although there'll be a photograph. This is an actual yellow star. It comes from my grandfather's overcoat. Of course, everybody in the family had one of these, but at the end of the war, when it was no longer necessary to wear one of these, my mother would have burnt all of them, but she decided to keep one, and this is the one. You probably have seen pictures of people wearing it. It was compulsory, and it extended down to 7-year-olds. My sister was 8 at the time, and she very much objected to wearing one, but of course it was enforced. But she was happy to find when she went to school that many of her good friends were also wearing one, so then she didn't mind so much. In April, so almost immediately after, a number of other discriminating laws were passed, and Jews weren't allowed to own simple things like radios or bigger things like cars. They were not allowed to take taxis, no telephones. They were denied all of these things. So when my mother was well in labor in end of May, she had to walk to the local train, but she first gave my sister to the neighbor to look after. My father was in forced labor, so he wasn't around. She walked to the train, about a 20-minute walk, then took the train, and there was a 15-minute walk the other end. And this is while seriously in labor. And she went to the hospital, gave birth to me. In the hospital, she was very well treated, I should say, and she always mentioned that the nurses there were all nuns, and they were all lovely, even though she was lying there with her yellow star on her nightgown. So I was born without further ado, and here I am. My mum took me home, and within 3 weeks, we were first forced to leave that home. We lived in a nice area of one of the suburbs of Budapest, and they decided that area would be completely free of Jews, cleansed of Jews, would be the expression. So we had to leave, but in true bureaucratic manner, they issued a receipt. This is a receipt and it's signed by 3 different people for our apartment, and also we had to leave everything behind. And there's 6 pages of, you don't have to read it, obviously it's in Hungarian in any case, but there's 6 pages of items from dining table to underpants. Everything neatly signed, off, counted, etc. We have the receipt, but of course never saw anything of that ever again. So what did my mom do? She had an 8-year-old and a 3-week-old child. She again walked to the train, took the train, came into town, and she went to her parents' house. When I say house, everybody loved, it's like Paris, everybody lived in apartment blocks. So in this apartment blocks, my grandparents had a flat, and what has happened is the authorities decided to concentrate Jews. So certain buildings were designated to be yellow star houses, which meant Jews and only Jews could live there. The non-Jews had to move out, but there were plenty of places for them to move to, the apartments that Jews had vacated. There wasn't enough space for these things. I should say, sorry, my grandparents' house was one of these yellow star houses. So we moved in there. My aunt and uncle and cousin also moved there. So including my great-grandmother, there were 10 of us in this little flat. But we were very happy because 10 was quite a low number. Some people were, twice as dense, and we only had the family, so we didn't have to share our small flat with outsiders. My father was again sent to forced labor camp. He had been back for a while in between. And during the summer of 1944, I think we were more or less okay. I'm not talking about my father now, except for one very difficult occasion when Nazis, let me correct myself. Hungarian police came to the house and they said, all Jews downstairs. By then there were no men because they were all in forced labor if they were still alive. But my mother and my aunt were taken away. Children were allowed to stay, and old people, old women, like my grandma and my great-grandmother, were allowed to stay behind. My mother and aunt were taken to a collection point where Jewish women were collected before deportation. And they were guarded by Hungarian gendarmes, police, and a few German recruits, ordinary soldiers, not SS, but ordinary soldiers. My mother had the thought, the idea, of going up to one of the German guards and saying to him, I should say that German was her first language. She had German governess when she was a child and only learned Hungarian when she went to primary school. So she spoke really fluent German. And he said to the man, a young man, my sister and I have babies at home, and if we don't go back, they will die. And this soldier, who I presume was just an ordinary farm lad, recruit, swore at them very roundly in German and told them to bugger off. The Hungarians wouldn't have liked this, but they didn't want to. A German was still of high status, so they wouldn't contradict the German. So my mum and aunt came back. And I should add that my aunt had procured some cyanide, I don't know where from, and this was given to my grandmother to give to the babies if the mothers didn't come back within, I don't know, 48 hours. So I owe my life to this German guy. At the same time that we're talking about, the summer of 1944 was a terrible time. As I say, we were surviving reasonably. It was just curfew and we lived. But in the countryside and the other towns of Hungary, deportations began. They rounded up all the Jews, put them on cattle cars. I'm sure you know the story, took them to Auschwitz. And the bulk of them were gassed immediately. And some of them stayed to do labor, and very few of those actually survived. And the efficiency with which this was done, over 6 weeks, I think 300 would be the, let me just see. No, it's not on there, okay. Something like 300,000 Jewish people were murdered. Including a lot of our family who lived not in Budapest but elsewhere. The deportations went on only for 6 weeks, so it was very, very efficient. And then for political reasons they stopped. Again, a conflict between Hitler and the Hungarian leader called Horthy, Admiral Horthy. And that's later on in the year they started again. Sorry, I keep